Thank you everyone for joining us today. If you don't know me, I'm a marine geologist and received my PhD from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. For my doctorate research, as well as postdoc positions in Okinawa, Japan, and Eilat, Israel, all over, I became one of the world's experts in the study of Mesophotic reef geology. As I studied geology, structure, growth, ecology, and the recovery of these types of reef systems and their shallow water counterparts. Mesophotic reefs are found between 100 and 500 feet deep. They're beyond recreational scuba limits, and there's a lot of potential for them for preserving reef species, but we can talk about that at another time. It's actually my knowledge of reefs in general, though, and of reef structure specifically that brought me to working with Shelby and Ocean Rescue Alliance as the Director of Strategy and Lead Scientist. Now, I was asked today to give a little talk about some of my past research. It's kind of fun and exciting. It's technical diving and deep stuff. However, I realize that most people don't even think of coral reefs when they hear the word geology. And that's a problem, in my opinion. People usually ask me, isn't geology just looking at a bunch of rocks? Or, you just do rocks, right? That's, of course, after they assume that because I say marine geologist, they say, do you work with dolphins? Whole misconception there. The truth is that the geology of reefs is vital to all of our lives. You just don't know it. As such, this month I decided I would review the topic of reef geology, which will pave the way for another talk I'll give in a future date on mesophotic reefs and technical diving in an upcoming Aura videos series. So another reason to stay tuned. Now, just to warn you, as I did if you missed, reef geology would be a full semester class in college. So there's a lot to cover today. I've tried to keep it nice and light though. If there is something you don't understand, if it's not clear, just ask a question in the chat and the moderator, Shelby, will either ask me if it's really relevant at that exact moment, or we can wait towards the end. You can also email me at dweinstein@oceanrescuealliance.org if you have any questions. Now to start off, that's all the introduction stuff. Now to start off, I wanted to show you how reefs and what you may think of as geology are closely connected. A reef is part of a coral, like displayed in the lower left, is part of a coral reef, right? After a long amount of time, full coral reefs can become fossilized into rock formations, such as what makes up the Florida Keys. This is a picture from work I did in Winley Key. The Florida Keys foundation actually consists of the rock. So any building in the Florida Keys is essentially on this rock at some point. The Florida Key consists of habitat similar to the current reef track, but more inland, obviously, and about 125,000 years older. Now, slabs of reef limestone formation like this one also contain fossils from some of the same species of coral that are common in the, oop, did I miss it? Missed a few that are common in the reef track today. Anyways, beyond supporting an infrastructure of the Keys itself and other tropical areas, because these types of reef rocks are found elsewhere, as you can see, fossilized coral is also found in the limestone quarries of the Keys itself, and creates infrastructure, literally creates some of the old buildings from southern Florida. So here's an example of corals creating structure, literally creating habitat for humans. And why do we care about structure? Well, structure is the foundation for diverse, healthy habitat. So these are pictures from Fort Lauderdale, where we do some work, and Tampa, where some people live in the Florida area. And you see all these buildings, and you need these buildings to support a healthy habitat. You need the structure to provide homes for all the people that live and work in this ecosystem, if you will. And it's the same thing with coral reefs. I love this picture, these two pictures. The one on the left is from Eilat, Israel. The one on the right is from the Keys. And it literally shows, especially the one on the right, the fish kind of creating their own, they have their own, each little branch is a little hotel for these fish. And so the structure that the coral provides is literally creating a habitat. Now, what does the structure of reef ecosystems provide? Can anyone type in? I don't know if that's easy. Does anyone have an answer? Like, what does it provide? Shelby, you can tell me because I can't see. Did anyone type anything?
Yes, people can type in the chat if you guys would like to.
I'm just curious. Well, I got to know what I'm working with here. What do you know what the structure of reefs can provide us?
Or if anyone wants to chime in verbally, they can.
Or people being shy? All right. Well, we'll play the coy card. I'll give the classics. So coral reefs, the structure of coral reefs provide huge amounts of services to our world. They're critical for food supply. Something like 1 billion people alone in Asia get about a fourth of their fish catch and their protein from coral reefs. Biodiversity, there's something like 25% of all marine species are found at some point in coral reefs. They provide a huge amount of shoreline protection. Coral reefs, about 150,000 kilometers of shoreline in 100 countries receive some sort of protection from coral reefs. Obviously, they add an immense amount of money to the global economy and to the blue economy is the new term that people are using. They provide us answers about what the past was like, and they're really important as pharmaceuticals. I've worked on reefs where we were working on a type of coral that has anti-inflammatory properties. And so there's always new compounds that nature has created that we need, and if we lose the reefs, we lose those compounds. But the problem is you've all heard that coral reefs aren't doing too well. We hear about this all the time. Coral reefs are bleaching, they're dying. And the problem is when you lose the health, you lose a lot of the features that come with it. Pharmaceuticals, you lose some of the economics. Now it's interesting because once they die, you still have some of that structure. So you don't lose all these issues right away, but eventually you will. Eventually they'll get degraded and you won't have coastal protection or anything like that. So it's really important to think about the structure, not just the pretty coral on top, but actually the structure they create. And so why is this all relevant to Ocean Rescue Alliance? Well, we say with Aura, we're trying to save the ocean one reef at a time. Structure is what Aura does. One of the main aspects of what we do. One of Aura's main goals is to help strategically create reef structures through realistic modules, ultimately intended for wave attenuation reduction, and also creating artistic structures to both attract biological recovery and stimulate the public's interest. So here's some fish that are that are on some of the structures we put in. I love this structure in the upper left that shows right here. Oh, I'm sorry, I was trying to get the pen, it didn't work. But there's that structure here in the upper left that is really, we're going to be using that for wave attenuation, and it really looks like a reef. And on the upper right, we have this beautiful mermaid that's all these fish are just attracted to it because of the structure. So it's really the structure that's key to a reef ecosystem. Now, when we talk about the structure of natural reefs, which are initially made up of coral polyps, we have to consider what a reef really is, right? And that really is a thin biological veneer on a vast rock deposit. So they're not just rocks after all. Coral reefs create and primarily build on reef limestone. And so with that, we've started talking about how the structure of reefs is important to you and to the study of coral reef overall. I mean, if you're like fish, it's important to you because at some point you're getting some of your protein from a coral reef, most likely. Anyways, this background is going to be helpful for you to follow my next talk about Mesophotic geology in the future. And this background just gives you an idea of why the structure of reefs is important. And with that background in mind, I'm going to kind of give you a crash course on reefs from a geologic perspective, quickly going through a lot of basic but really important topics. I'm going to go through them slightly quickly because we don't have a lot of time. So I might have to speed up or skip one or two, and I apologize, but you can always ask me some questions later. Then I'll try and kind of give you a take-home message of if there's anything to take away from what I'm saying, if you're for these points to be taken away. Just to let you know, at every point, I kind of put in the upper top a takeaway message of the slide or where we are to kind of help you follow along. And also I'll show this outline slide periodically so you can kind of follow along with where I am in this talk. So here are some reef deposits I've worked on. And you're like, well, reef deposits, they don't look like coral reefs. Well, these were coral reefs. Really healthy, beautiful coral reefs. One in the Dominican Republic, one in the Woodland Key, Florida, that I showed you before. And I just want to show you them. And because people don't even always realize what is a reef, right? Now, given that we didn't have the most audience participation, and this is a virtual talk, I'm gonna dispense with asking you to tell me what you think is a reef. And just tell you what a reef is, it depends on the perspective of the person defining it. And the definition of a reef doesn't always have to include coral. And I like this picture here because it kind of shows the modern and the ancient right on top of each other. It's a really cool picture. Reef actually has a maritime origin, the definition. It has anything that might damage the keel of a ship. From the Nordic term rift is the general idea. A line of rocks or sand, I mean, if you go to the dictionary, it's a line of rocks or sand above the water surface of the sea, often dangerous to ships, a hazardous obstruction. You'll notice none of these actually have a biological origin in the name, in the definition. But then the biologists come, and they're obviously more concerned with the organism. So you get a definition such as a closed packing, aggregation, and successful growth of sessile, so non-moving marine organisms that grow upon the seafloor, or massive nearshore deposits of coral skeleton material. Now, from a geologic perspective, it's a bit different. The criteria for a reef for geology is that it's organic, it's made of carbonate, and it has topographic relief. It's above the surrounding material. And a definition I like the most is discrete carbonate structure formed by in situ or bound organic components that develops topographic relief upon the seafloor. Again, this is going a little deep into it, but essentially it's organic carbonate, which is calcium carbonate, limestone, if you will, and it has topographic relief. Usually it has biological origin, it must have a rigid structure as well. And it has this topographic relief that has some sort of impact on the local hydrodynamic conditions. So the reef itself actually changes how water flows around the area. Okay. So now you know what a reef is, and especially what it is from a geologic perspective. Why do we even care? Why do we learn about reef geology? There's actually a host of reasons why we should learn about reef geology. I mean, obviously I'm biased because that's what I've studied for my career. This list is by no means extensive, but let's delve into it to give you a better understanding of why, again, you should care and why people like me study reefs from a geologic perspective. First, there's the historical perspective on future change. One essential reason to learn about reef geology is that geology gives us a critical historic perspective to consider modern issues, processes, disasters, and changes. What is normal currently? What has happened before? What can we learn from the past? Do we know that the die-off right now that's happening on our reefs, has that happened in the past? Maybe it's just a normal cycle. How fast has it happened? Do reefs, have they bleached in the past? These are not trivial questions. To be able to understand what's happening now, we have to have that historical perspective. It's the same idea when you go to school and they say, oh, history is bound to repeat itself. And that's why we study history in school. Exactly why. It's critical to understand our history, to understand our where we're going and where we're at and where we're going. Let me give you some examples. Can reefs decline from rapid sea level change? Has this happened before? So a pivotal recent study published in the journal Nature Geosciences by a few colleagues I've published with before found that reefs on the Great Barrier Reef died 5 times, not just because of sea level rise alone, but because of high sedimentation influx and poor water quality. So studies like these inform us that while climate change is a huge problem, we can still make an impact on reefs at a localized level if we stop things like poor water quality and sedimentation. They also show us that changes to coral reefs might be pretty common in the past and have nothing to do with humans, right? So that's kind of cool. Maybe not all is lost with coral reefs, and we know some of this because of geology. However, I'll say that the timing of these changes are unprecedented. So I would say don't just start thinking climate change isn't an issue. It most definitely is, but it's more complicated than might be talked about in the media. Now, alternatively, studying reef geology can show that current changes in coral species may not be normal in the past, before Homo sapiens were widespread. And this picture here just shows that in this one place in the, I think this is Belize, this is, yeah, they worked in Belize. They took a core, they put a rod down into a rock, and they pulled it out, and they found that the main corals that are basically leaving the Caribbean right now, we've had a big die-off of acropid corals that used to be throughout the Caribbean. There's not been a precedent for this before. There hasn't been a die-off in the recent past. And so that was a really important study. However, I will say that other studies have shown that there have been instances when there has been a slight pause in this type of coral. So again, it's not exclusive, but it just, these are the types of questions that looking at the geology helps us understand, is how current changes, like the die-off right now, may have looked in the past. And we can look for reasons for it, and that can help us make better informed decisions. Related to that is a general understanding of past environments from a ecological perspective. Related to that ecological perspective, corals can tell us about what the climate used to be like. This is all because they often form in predictive layers like tree rings, which can be dated, and also they include a lot of chemical information about the marine environment. The tree rings don't give you they give you the atmospheric information. They don't give you the marine information. Individual corals don't live forever, but when you piece them together, you can start painting a really interesting picture of what a very detailed understanding of how climate has changed with time. And this one is showing sea surface temperature anomalies. And it shows that there's been points in this coral's history where it was very warm and also very cold, and coincidentally when things have died. And so in this particular instance, this example shows that this coral wasn't doing so well, not so much because of temperature changes, but for fluctuations in, I believe this was iron. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it was slightly related to temperature. But these are kinds of the questions that we need to understand, like that it's not just changing of temperature, but how changes in temperature might affect coral. And we look toward the past to give us that information. We also study coral geology because it informs us about evolution. Think about it. At one point, North and South America were open, and there was this nice seaway between these two continents where species from the Pacific and from the Caribbean were able to exchange genetic material. That closed because of plate tectonics, and suddenly the evolution of corals in these two different basins were fundamentally changed. So to understand the evolution of reefs, which is an important topic for assisted evolution and trying to figure out ways to make corals more resilient to current conditions, we have to understand how they've evolved. Reef geology is also important for understanding just the structures that are built. We'll talk about this a little more later, but this is just a picture from where I was in a lot showing a fringing reef and how that is developed. Another reason, I can't see if anyone's going to raise their hand, but who drinks water or drives a car? I literally think my parents are listening and they're sitting in their car right now. Another huge reason to learn about reef geology is their importance in creating oil and water reservoirs. These reefs, when they become fossils, are so porous. They're like Swiss cheese. They naturally hold, the skeletons have a lot of holes in them in the limestone. It's a great place for fluids that bubble up from the water because they're lighter, and they'll get stuck if there's a what we call a seal, like a very impermeable type of rock or something that's preventing that from moving further up into the and the oil will get stuck there. And so understanding where reefs are in the past and how they developed has been phenomenally important for our society. Carbonate reserves are important contributors to oil and gas production and contain more than 1/2 of those globally discovered. So I know we can argue the merits of using hydrocarbons all we want, but we still do need to drive right now. We still use plastics. And so we can't deny that understanding coral reefs has been critical for advancement of society in that way. And regardless of what you think, water is definitely going to always be needed. And understanding how these have developed. And we often look at the modern example to help us inform where to find these types of deposits. All right, so that's why we learn about reef geology. Next, I'm just going to really quickly talk about reefs through time. So reefs are actually quite common biologically created geologic structures and have been around on Earth almost as long as life has existed. What has changed is the type of reefs and who was building them. And these changes were usually related to how the chemistry of the ocean changed through time, which was also related to plate tectonics. And then also the type of reef changed based on species composition, competitions, evolution, and extinctions. The first type of reef building organisms were called reefs were called stromatolites, and they were built by cyanobacteria, these tiny little organisms. During the Precambrian, about greater than 80% of the geologic time scale, this huge amount of time, the only reefs were these stromatolitic organisms. Now they're not as common anymore, but these represent some of the oldest life forms. A really fascinating area to study. This is kind of what these ancient reefs might have looked like. This is a modern example. They're not common everywhere, but the lower picture, unfortunately, I've never been to Australia, but the lower picture is one in the exumas that I took, and they're quite interesting, but they're not found in many places for competition reasons in terms of competition with other organisms. After that, we're going to go through this quickly. You have archocyathids. These were calcifying sponges in the Cambrian about 550 million years ago. Then you had, related to current modern corals, but not quite, you had these tabular and rugose corals. After that, we finally see Scarlactinian. These are the relatives of modern day corals. And this is important for the Mesophotic reef talk, but they initially started as platy, small organisms that were in deep water. But then they were outcompeted by what we call rudis. These are actually bivalves, and these created huge, huge reefs of bivalves. And that was in the Cretaceous, right before the dinosaurs died off. After the dinosaurs died off, after that big extinction event, we come back to Scarlactinian corals, became the dominating reef builders, and that's the focus of this talk, obviously. All right, reef types. So this is your classic zonation of coral reefs, your lagoon, patch reefs. I'm not going to go into that too much, just to say there's ways that we break up how reefs are distributed on island or coastline. Here's another example of some of these. I like it because it's 3D, it's kind of cool, and it has these nice pictures with them. But these are the kind of the different reef types. Now, Darwin's theory on reef evolution has told us a lot about, about reef evolution and reef type. He actually published the structure and distribution of coral reefs 17 years before what everyone thinks of him as was the origin of the species. Darwin was a reef geologist, among other things. He was mostly a naturalist. But anyways, workers in the Italian Alps and elsewhere during the 19th century had already concluded that there was a lot of great upheaval of the Earth's surface because they found coral reefs in the Alps really far away from the oceans and really high up. It was already known that while modern shallow water corals do not generally exist at deeper depths than 100 meters, many fossilized reefs attained a thickness of hundreds of thousands of meters. It was correctly postulated that this reflected the upward building of the reef by the organisms in a photic zone, and that they sank eventually. And this process was called subduction. So here it is, the island sinks with time, and you keep on building. This is that white area on the left that's representing the coral. You keep on building it up. Okay. And it's not always subduction. I'll say Darwin didn't have it completely right, but it was a pretty good guess from where he was at. There's also sea level fluctuations that are changing how these things are formed. Darwin argued that fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and atolls represented an evolutionary continuum from former to latter. The problem is he lacked a mechanism to explain his theory. He proposed that the spatial change was a proxy for temporal progression, if you will. It was really a great idea, but he just didn't have the proof. His idea wasn't widely accepted. It was even laughed at by many people until deep cores through various atolls in the South Pacific near Midway, more than a century later, revealed the sunken volcanoes. So here's a core from that paper, the seminal paper, where they dug essentially a hole through the reef, and after, this says, I think this is meters, 400 meters, they hit a rock called basalt, which is a volcanic rock, and they had no idea that there was a volcano there. And this proved Darwin his theory of subsidence. But they didn't have a mechanism for this. But that comes from plate tectonics, was discovered in 1965, more than 100 years after Darwin first proposed his reef theory. And this is the mechanism that was needed so we spread as these volcanoes move away from their initial sources. They move, they cool, and they sink. But the corals keep on building up and up. And so this is a lot of how reefs are developed, at least in the Pacific area and tropical areas. It's a little different on coastlines. And because I put all those caveats, while Darwin's ideas of subsidence as a universal control on reef type were flawed. His work and his work of his contemporaries still provided many of the fundamental truths we have about the foundation of reef science. And so this shows you that tectonics can help control where and how reefs develops. And this leads us to our next topic. And I'm going to try and start speeding up a little because I know we're getting close to time. Controls on reef development. It's really just a matter of scale. You have macro scale. This is the tectonics and sea level, and that's on large distances and geologic timescales. You have micro scale controls on reef development. This is temperature, salinity, and wave energy. And this is generally a physical oceanographic in nature on the size of ocean basins and historical timescales. And then you have micro scale controls on reef development, light, nutrients, sediment, under the topography underneath the reef. And that affects the organism, and that's more on the school of on the timeline of a career like mine. So just to start things off, I always like to use this stupid comic because I don't know, geologists like a lot of puns. So you know, first things first, in geology, plate tectonics is one of those unifying theories. And so here's the classic picture of plate tectonics, and to show that it really has an impact on how reefs develop. So we already talked about the islands, these atolls, and how they developed and evolved with time. We also talked about how tectonics affects the evolution of reefs and ultimately reef development. Another interesting thing is how it affects where reefs can develop, and that's found where I was working in Israel. And so what we find here is, again, you have these terraces. You can literally see it in this picture. This is from a point in Egypt. And you can see that there were different fluctuations in sea level, such that you have these reefs build much higher than sea level is right now. But you also have interesting aspects of the tectonics here. And the entry point to the Red Sea is actually relatively shallow. There were times in Earth history that the sea level dropped below that depth, or essentially below that depth. And what happened was, because it got so low, there was no exchange of water, and the Red Sea became very, very salty and nothing lived. Eventually, the sea level rised again, the glaciers melted, and you had more water. And then coral started coming back and repopulating the Red Sea. But because it's so close to the equator, the corals that were coming had to be able to tolerate very, very warm water. And so only the ones that could tolerate that really warm water started and made their way little by little. They started going north all the way up to where I was working at the top of the Red Sea. And the interesting thing about these corals is these never bleach, and it's because they've been adapted because of this geology to handle higher temperatures than they experience now. And so there's another example of how sea level change and plate tectonics have a really big impact on reef development. Now, there's a lot more in terms of sea level change and how reefs move and develop with time. I just don't have the time to go through it. So these are some nice pictures. I'm happy to talk about it another time. But the main issue is that each time sea level rises over an area, reefs will form, they'll change, and it's this nice interplay between sea level rise and subsidence that creates interesting deposits. And informs us about how reefs develop. On the mesoscale, coral reefs are generally restricted to water between 18 and 30, 35, 36 degrees Celsius, with an optimal range between 26 and 28 degrees. This is generally restricted to the latitudes between 20 and 25 north and south. And so that's what this is showing. And also regional variations in wave climate have been shown to exert a primary control on the character of the shallow water reef crests and the zonation along the front, at least in the Caribbean. This picture gives a little bit of an idea of these interactions, but again, I'm not going to go too far into it. Just to say that you can see that wave energy on the bottom, the amount of light, all these change what's going to be developed. So again, the amount of light that's going to be, that penetrates into the ocean column is going to impact and have that micro scale impact on how reefs develop. And lastly, I'll say there's this Andesite topography. This is a seismic image. So that's sound waves going through the rocks and penetrating off different surfaces. And they show us what's underneath the ground, underneath the ocean. And what we find is beneath some reefs, you actually have topographic highs, so that reefs might just develop on top of what was there before. This isn't always the case, but what I'm saying is that we need to consider the Andesite topography when we're considering reef development. Now, in terms of another topic for reef geology, if reef components in the carbonate budget. The builders and modifiers of a reef that respond to the previous list of what control reef development ultimately represent a few key processes that govern the physical building and erosion of a reef structure. Extensive coring of reefs has taught us that reef structure is not just about coral growth, but a complex interaction feedback of many processes with a term, and it's a term that we call carbonate budgets, the carbonate budget of a reef. Carbonate budget is a way of systematically evaluating all the positive and negative material changes to the physical structure of a reef. A carbonate budget evaluates reef structure and controlling factors and the structural sustainability. This will ultimately lead to understanding of long-term reef buildup and accretion. And there's some main processes. You have the primary buildup, but you also have other organisms that add carbonate to the material. But you also have bioerosion that takes away material. On top of all that, you have storms that might come, or animals that might erode it, but then poop material in other places, defecate. It sounds funny, but it actually changes the budget of a coral reef. These are some pictures of storms that have literally on the right show like meters worth of sand that's been removed from storms. So all of these things come together to understand how a reef ultimately builds up and erodes with time and what will get preserved in the fossil record. And so that's a big thing that us geologists look at. So we're not as much just concerned with how the coral itself is growing, but how the reef, how the structure is building and changing with time. And as we said in the past, in the very beginning, it's the structure that's really providing a lot of critical services. Lastly, I want to talk about reef accretion. This is a topic that's really important to me. When we tend to say corals grow, reefs accrete about an order of magnitude less. So when we say accretion, we're talking about the long-term buildup of the rock, not just the coral. The general idea is that accretion decreases with depth because coral growth rates decrease with depth because of light. And this is a really important concept in coral reef geology theory. Reefs accrete. Reef accretion essentially is a vertical calcium carbonate accumulation with time. So this is usually measured. People will take a core either through a ship, or divers will take core through the rock. They'll get something that looks like this, and they'll do uranium, thorium, or carbon dating of these samples. And they'll measure the distance between these samples, and that'll give us a vertical accumulation. And this tells us about how reefs grow with time. And like I said, the general theory has been that reef accretion decreases with depth. Although that's not really always the case. And that is a kind of indicator for the next talk that I'll give, is that while we used to think that reef accretion decreases with depth, we're starting to find that there's not much information on the topic, and that might not really be the case, that you can actually grow significant amount of material in deeper depth. This means that these deeper reefs, which people talk about as being refugia for shallow reefs that are at risk, these deeper reefs actually can create structure that can harbor important fish species and coral species. So with that, let's finish this. We talked about, again, there's a lot of different topics on why reef geology matters and what reef geology is. So essentially, we have to remember that a reef is a discrete carbonate structure formed by in situ or bound organic components that develop topographic reef upon the seafloor. Reef geologic structure provides many of the essential services attributed to coral reefs. Yeah, like look at this structure. These fish would not be here without this massive structure there. Reef geology informs about reef evolution, geomorphology, paleoclimatology, structural sustainability, and critical reservoir potential. And lastly, reef morphology, structure, accretion, and type rely on a complex set of evolutionary, physical, geologic, and biologic processes. Hopefully I didn't confuse you all too much. I'm really happy to answer any questions now or in the future. I put my email on the bottom, and I hope I just kind of give you a little education that coral reefs aren't just beautiful pictures with fish or a coral, which I literally put in these pictures here, but they're vast, massive structures that have a long geologic history, and that's the structures themselves what really provide a lot of the ecosystem services that we all talk about and rely on in our everyday life. With that, I'll say thank you.